Constituents of a relational enterprise philosophy. So now let us see about what are the constituents which make up any relational enterprise. So for example, let it be a building construction industry or the software industry. We need to go about some constituents. We need to define some constituents for a relational enterprise. So the constituents of relational enterprise have been listed here. It forms a small triangle made up of 4 divisions. It consists of tools, processes, method, and architecture. We need some support for architecture, method or process, and so we need to depend on something called as tools. So there should be a process to scale up the method of industrial activity. So unless and until there is a process, the entire thing lands into a chaos. So therefore, we need to scale up a method to progress in an industrial activity. And then we have something called as a method to see that how to apply the architecture concepts in a step-by-step fashion. And the architecture will determine the selected approach from a universe of approaches. When it comes to architecture, there can be a number of ways and methods to make this particular thing possible. But we need to select a particular approach from a universe of approaches. So coming to this architecture, it is a foundation of concepts and techniques selected from a universe of potential foundations that define the characteristic structure of all buildings designed using the approach. For example, an approach based on using building blocks and components can be compared with other alternative approach like an architecture solely based on customized constraints. So here we can manage with building blocks and components, or otherwise we can also depend on something called as customized constructs. In customized constructs, we develop it from the scratch. We don't depend upon the off-the-shelf components. Whereas in another approach, we use building blocks or components as off-the-shelf components wherein we don't need to start from the scratch. So there are different kinds of architectures which come into existence. Then comes the method. Method makes explicit the step-by-step procedures to be followed in applying the architecture to projects. So when we define a particular method, we need to stick on to a step-by-step procedure as to how to fulfill that particular architecture or apply that architecture to a certain project. So when it comes to process, the process allows the method to be scaled up so that it can be applied to projects with many interesting activities and parties. So it is the way in which it allows the method to be scaled up so that all the projects related to this particular method can be applied with different kinds of activities and parties. Then comes the tools. Tools support all aspects of enterprise and explicitly the activities of architecture, method and process. So here when we think of a architecture, we need to select a kind of a method, and also we need to see what is the process to achieve the method, and also we need to gather on what are the kind of tools that we can have to support this particular process and method. So tools will support all aspects of the enterprise and explicitly the activities of the architecture, the method and process. So a method is more basic and is described in the same way as a project by breaking down into its various activities. So a project ends when the last activity has been performed and the product or building has been taken into operation. So likewise, even in the software industry, until the product has been released, we call it as a project. So in terms of project, we can split it into a number of sub-projects or subtasks, we call it as, and then we perform each and every activity with a kind of methodology or with a kind of method. When the project ends, the final product or the final release will be the software which has been released into the industry and it has become fully operational. So a process lasts as long as the product lasts, and describes how different activities interact during the whole life of the product. So here, when the process starts, the product also, the development of a product also has been started, and also the different activities interact during the whole life of the product. So the architecture may be based on solely on using building blocks and components, or solely on using customized constructs made by craftsmen or by any combination. So it can be, as we have already discussed, this architecture can be from already built-in components, we call it as off-the-shelf components, or it can start from the scratch going on with the customized construct. So whatever we want, we can just go ahead designing that. So that is what we call it as customized construct. Whereas in off-the-shelf components, we use the off-the-shelf components or building blocks to make up one thing or the other. Examples of building blocks for a house are off-the-shelf products like windows, doors, and bathtubs. We don't sit and manufacture windows then and there. We don't sit and manufacture doors or bathtubs then and there. When the house has been constructed, we go for buying bathtubs, or we go for buying doors, or we go for buying windows, so that we can directly take them and fix it into the house. So that is where we are not developing it from the scratch for the windows and doors or bathtubs, but we are using off-the-shelf components. So now looking into different architectures where a particular project can take over is architecture approach A, wherein we have a particular architecture can be used for office building, it can be used for a warehouse, it can be used for a single family dwelling, that is a single bedroom house, or it can be used for a multiple family dwelling, we call it as a multiple bedroom house. But there can be an architecture wherein a particular warehouse, to construct a particular warehouse, we may be using a number of architectures. Probably architecture approach A is taken into consideration, architecture approach B is taken into consideration, and architecture approach C is also taken into consideration for constructing the same warehouse. Because probably for the first floor we have considered architecture A. For second floor, we considered architecture B, and for third floor, we have considered the architecture C. So we can use various kinds of architectures for the same thing, or we can use the same architecture for various purposes also. So this is how we can use different architectures even for building the software or developing the software products. So coming into these activities of building construction, we have three things that are creative design, construction, and long-term support. So under creative design, we have tools, process, methods, and architecture are the four things that we have already seen, because we start with the architecture, and to define this architecture, we have a certain methodology which takes on different methods, and to implement that particular method, we follow a step-by-step process for which we'll be using or taking the help of different kinds of tools that are available to attain that particular step-by-step procedure. So this is a kind of framework we use even for creative design, construction, as well as long-term support. So coming to the activities of building construction, the activities of building construction are creative design, construction, and long-term support. Well-defined interfaces are needed to make the transition between phases smooth and seamless. The details of the latter activities are directly related to factors in the preceding activities, and whenever possible, traceability should be applied, enabling us to return to relevant factors in previous activities when problems arise. Always, traceability is a very important factor to see that whenever there is a problem or whenever there is an error that has occurred, we need to trace back as to finding out the root cause of the problem. So therefore, whether it is building construction or software development, both of them needs quite a lot of traceability, which is a very important aspect. So coming to the creative design, Transformation from a set of requirements and vague notions of what is desired to a structured plan of the building and a plan of action for its implementation are the creative activities of new development. So maybe to construct a building or to develop a piece of software, we need to have some kind of requirements coming into picture. Initially, we will have a kind of vague notion to wherein we try to form a set of requirements, and we see that these set of requirements are now getting into a structured plan, whether it is for building or for developing a software. So requirements for building a house, for example, are expressed in functional terms like architectural drawing showing place and function of rooms, or in terms of construction drawing that specifies building standards to withstand strong winds, moisture, wear and tear, etc. So likewise, even in the software, we need some kind of requirements to develop a piece of software, and we need a kind of architecture to be in place to show what kind of components or what kind of modules are trying to interact with each other, what is a function of each module in itself, and what kind of communication or interaction is going on between those modules is what we need to define in the architecture. So with respect to software industry is maturing but still has a long way to go. So the architectural and construction drawings may be the only basis for examining the building prior to its actual production. But in other approaches, a small model house may be constructed. So when we look into the actual construction industry, we can as well build a small model house in order for our customers to get appreciate the actual house. So when series of houses having same basic building architecture are to be developed, then one or more sample houses or prototypes are constructed. So these prototypes allow potential buyers to evaluate the functionality of the house and to debug or improve the basic architecture. For modern buildings, in addition to building standards and norms, significant attention is given to approaches that exploit large building blocks based upon sub-assemblies of modules and components. These practices makes large-scale building constructions economically rational and ensure quality and safety of the final product. So likewise, we develop a model house only to see that if that particular prototype can be evaluated by the user and the functionality will be portrayed properly. So next comes the construction. Once a creative design is done, the first activity in construction is to provide implementation details of these architectural and constructional plans, that is to go from more abstract towards a more concrete plan. After a concrete plan is evolved, production or implementation takes place. So production is thus the last phase of construction. So the number of people involved up to the point of production is quite small in comparison with the number of people involved in the actual production. So the production is a result of manufacturing the more abstract construction plans as well as detailed construction plan. Therefore, a clear method and process by which the construction plans are followed are essential ingredients of successful mass production. So the entrepreneur who takes the responsibility for the production according to the building architecture and construction development for large-scale building projects. Entrepreneur in turn lists out the services of subcontractors who take certain portions of the total project. Standards and norms and usage of building blocks and components become vital for the subcontractors to perform their services properly. And apart from these two, we also need long-term support. Building construction projects, custom designed and mass produced, must take account of the fact that the product should exist for many years. Architectural approach must take into account of life cycle requirements for maintenance, alteration and extension. So this is how we conclude this particular